joining us to talk about some of the big challenges which the World Economic Forum actually sees going forward, and also a little bit about the India story, the President of the World Economic Forum. Thank you very much, sir, for being with us. Let's talk a little bit about India, since we are an Indian network. In as much as a lot of what I described, Mr. Brende, actually does affect India as well, there is a sense of hope because of the GDP numbers. Where does the World Economic Forum actually see India heading?
So we are still expecting this year India to be the fastest growing of the large economies in the world.
Right.
And we think that's also going to continue in 2024. India is on a great growth trajectory, but of course the situation in the world is also affecting India. If things were not so gloomy, if there were no recessions in other countries, the growth would even have been higher.
Right.
So India is not operating in isolation, but we also do see with the change in the global value chains that more manufacturing is now being located in India. Before, India used to be the back office of the world, but now we see also more industrialization, and that's good.
And do you see a lot of that coming from China as well, which has been hit a lot by COVID? Do you see a shift from industries in China to India? For example, we've seen some leading companies like Apple really set up in India of late. But do you see that as being a trend?
Generally, I think companies are diversifying more their supply chains. It's not anymore only about just in time, it's also just in case. We do also see some friend-shoring, as you are alluding to, I think, indirectly.
Right.
I think India is benefiting from this. We are also, though, more optimistic when it comes to Chinese growth after the summer. And I think in 2024 we are expecting also quite considerable growth in China. No, of course, they're struggling with the short-term effects of COVID.
You use the word short-term effects. You are optimistic that the Chinese economy will bounce back because that's come at considerable cost. I mean, they've opened it up. A lot of people have suffered as a result. Their own numbers are now starting to come out. They are very large. How much longer do you see before we see China actually grow economically once again?
So we do expect that China by end of the spring will again see a real pickup in the growth numbers. We also know that the Chinese leadership is now focusing a lot on also deregulation and also on reforms related to the tech sector. So China is also the second largest economy in the world. So if there is then stimulus in the home market for consumption, that will not only mean a lot for Chinese companies, but that is also a very good stimulus to the global economy because there are 1.4 billion Chinese now that after the lockdowns that have gone on for some time will also be very eager to consume and not at least to travel.
Sure, absolutely. And that's opening up. Let's talk a little bit about what the risks report actually has come out with. Climate change, the biggest global risk over the next decade. How does that factor into a lot of your analysis going forward?
It is true that climate change is not something theoretically happening with our children or grandchildren. It's happening here and now. And we saw it last summer. Many places on our planet is having huge challenges with the heat. And we also see floods. We have seen droughts. So the cost of inaction, in our view, far exceeds the cost of action when it comes to climate change. So we have to really now walk the talk. We have to introduce the renewables very fast. We have to also double down on the energy transition because if we don't get those things done, we will see huge cost for humanity in the future. And there were places on our planet that is not possible to live.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the Ukraine situation. We are in Europe. Europe, it feels the crisis perhaps more than the other continents. So this is obviously being felt at so many levels. It's almost unbelievable, but we are worried around the world about the prospect or the possibility of, nuclear weapons, the tactical nuclear weapons being used. Who would have thought that 4 years back or 5 years back you'd have a session in the WEF on that? You wouldn't, but now you are. Is that something we really need to be thinking about, that we are talking about a situation in the Ukraine which is really spiraled out of control?
There's always a danger for further escalations, but it's not only the Ukraine crisis that is negatively impacting the geopolitics of the world. We have East Asia and the Chinese Sea. We also have the border between China and India that is not that peaceful for the moment. So we need now to solve things at the negotiating table and speak to each other and inject trust instead of trying to solve things fighting. On the Ukraine war, it is Russia that tried to invade Ukraine. They have never questioned the borders of Ukraine, and the attacks we're seeing now is breaking also with basic international law. You should never attack civilians. There should never be a target for a war. How this will play out moving forward is hard to see, but of course, Mr. Putin thought he was going to take Kiev in a day, or a week, or a month. That's not where it is now, and the amount and the strength of the Ukrainian people, I think, has surprised us all. They're not going to give in on this thing. So what we have to hope for is that there is no further de-escalation that has huge ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world.
And yet when you look at Russia and the role of Russia, oil imports continue. India believes in our national interest. We need to continue, or in fact even increase in importing Russian oil. But the point mentioned by the government of India is that, look, the amount that we are importing now is actually a fraction of what Europe continues to import. And therefore, the world is interdependent. You can't stop Russian oil imports. It's in no one's interest.
So I hear your arguments. The World Economic Forum doesn't have a view on this. We are an impartial organization, but it's a complex energy picture we are seeing. What is the fact is that Europe is not importing a lot of Russian gas anymore. It has diversified its energy sourcing, and energy prices are going down now, to everyone's surprise, in Europe, and things are looking a little bit better. When it comes to the Russian economy, we are very bearish on the years to come. We're seeing the economy is contracting quite severely. Even with this kind of high prices for oil, the Russian economy is really, really struggling, and people will have less money available, and it is an economy that is definitely shrinking, and a lot of talents are leaving the country. You know, human capital is the real capital for a country, and we think that maybe 300,000-400,000 young men, well educated, the IT engineers and etc., has left for Kazakhstan, has left for Serbia, has left for other European countries.
Two questions more. The digital divide which exists across the world. Now, it's mentioned in your risk report as well about the challenges which an improper spread of digitization can result in. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What do you see as some of the challenges there?
So one of the fundamental challenges when it comes to poverty eradication and growth in emerging economies is this digital divide. Around 3.6 billion people, half of our population, don't have access to reliable and competitive internet. How can the children in households then benefit and learn the new technologies if they're not even connected? Many schools are not connected. And this could have been such a possibility for leapfrogging, because today you can sit at home and you can access to great teachers at Harvard or some other great schools, and you can do it digitally. But a prerequisite for being part of this economy, the fourth industrial revolution, is that you have to have digital access, and that's why we launched also this Edison initiative from the forum. We have hundreds of companies signing up, and we want to make sure that every child and every school in the world has access to reliable and competitive internet in the future.
Cybersecurity, whether it affects individual countries or companies, it's a huge problem. Cybersecurity, how much is that a threat or a challenge going forward?
Since our societies are more and more relying on technologies, the internet. Of course, only small cyber attacks related to hydro or related to your financial system, your banking system. All this is digital now, can have terrible consequences. So that's why we also have to build resilience. We have to also be prepared for the worst. And we should not underestimate the cost of inaction when it comes to cybersecurity, and we should not have that as a blind spot, because then we're going to pay a huge price. Maybe the next pandemic is a cyber pandemic going on our digital infrastructure, and if that is brought down, then we will see, of course, major economic impact. So we should not be complacent.
One final question, and before we started, we were chatting on this. The G20, India has taken over presidency. It's being seen as a huge event across my country, and perhaps rightly so, because it is an opportunity for developing countries to speak together as one voice. And what you are looking at over here this year is the problem with fragmentation. How does the G20 potentially address that?
I think this is a huge opportunity for the government of India and also for the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. I think the G20 has to focus on a new growth compact. We need to get growth back. A further fragmentation of the global economy will lead to less growth and more poverty. It's the first time we see now that the poverty rate is increasing globally. We have had 3 decades with lower poverty rates. This is very serious. So I think that there will be no recovery without the trade and investment recovery. So if India can create like a global growth compact where you include also fighting climate change, trade and investments, also to use the new technologies, to leapfrog, that would be something very important, and to inject trust again in the global systems, because that is unfortunately lacking.
Absolutely. Mr. Borge Brende, wonderful speaking to you.
Thank you.
There we have it, Mr. Borge Brende, the President of the World Economic Forum, telling us a little bit about the challenges ahead. There are challenges at so many levels, but there's also somewhat of a sense of optimism that if the world were to become less fragmented, if a lot of these issues, particularly the environmental issues, the climate issues, were looked at seriously, then millions around the world would gain.